Welcome to SQL 5x5. 5 SQL tips in 5 minutes. I'm Bob Cozzi. Today's session is brought to you by SQL iQuery. Why are you wasting your time coding by hand? SQL iQuery was the first with DB2 to JSON, DB2 to XML, CSV, and the first with DB2 to HTML. SQL iQuery. It's SQL with a kick. This week's 5 and 5, accessing members in a multi-member file from SQL. Creating work files. Checking file access permissions. End of month date calculation. And converting between upper and lower case, all using SQL. Remember, all the examples presented here today are in RPG4 context, unless otherwise noted. The use of execute SQL for SQL statements should be assumed, but in most cases, I leave it off. Normally, everything has been tested using SQL iQuery and not RPG. First, accessing members. IBM applications frequently use members. We use the override database file command and specify a member. We go ahead and process that member. This is more of a legacy thing than a more contemporary application design, but nonetheless, it's still important to be able to access members using SQL. There is no SQL statement that supports querying a member, an individual member. So this capability where you could say select customer number, name, address from a file, parentheses, member, just doesn't exist. But there is a workaround, 2 of them in fact. First is obvious, use override database file command, then run your SQL statement. Alternatively, and what people are asking for, is the ability to create a reference to a member. And to do that in SQL, you need to create what's called an alias and then access that alias name in order to get to the member. Let me show you how to do both of these. To use override database file command with SQL statements, you first need to run the override database file command. Obviously, normally we would do this in CL or using the QCommandExec API and pass to it the override database file command. I prefer to use the SQL procedure named QCommandExec, which IBM provides, and you pass to it the command string you'd like to run, and it runs that command string in the SQL environment. So if you're running in server mode, it runs it in the server mode environment. And therefore, when you go to run your select statement or insert or update or delete, it will actually have processed that command properly for you. So here we're overriding the customer master file to member Chicago, and then we're going to just do a select into some local variables from the cusmas file. Since the override is in effect, we get to the member. This isn't much different from what we've been doing all along, including processing it with input primary and all those other things for the last 30 years. The other way to do it using just SQL is to use an alias. We use the create or replace alias statement and specify the library, file, and member name for which this alias applies. Then we reference the alias anytime we want to query or update that particular member. So in this example, we created an alias called Chicago, and we're putting it in QTemp. Now this is going to be over the Chicago member of the cusmas file. Now when we're going to reference qtemp.chicago down in our SQL statement, the select statement in this context, it's actually going to refer to the member Chicago in the cusmas file, and everything works the way we want. Which one of these 2 routines you use is entirely up to you, whether you call QCommandExec and pass it an override database file command, or choose to use the alias method, which I use now, and simply refer to the alias in your SQL statement. Remember though, using an alias does not require the member syntax. I'm just using it to show you that it is the only way to actually get to a member in SQL, unless you use an override database file command. Okay, number 2, let's create a work file using SQL. You can use SQL to create copies of data, including subsets, via the select statement. What you do is create a global temporary table. And there's 3 ways to define a temporary table. You can use a select statement, you can use the like clause, or you can define fields or columns with definitions similar to the way you would do a create or replace table statement. The SQL command to create a work file is called declare global temporary table. Declare global temporary table creates a table in the session schema, which is on IBM I, QTemp. Obviously, when the job ends, SQL deletes or drops that table. This is similar to create or replace table and using QTemp as the schema or library qualifier for the table being created. Note that with declare global temporary table, the schema name session is a synonym for QTemp. The advantage of creating a global temporary table versus, say, a create table statement in QTemp is that you can immediately copy the data from a result set into the newly created table. SQL syntax suggests using library schema session as the qualifier when you do the declare global temporary table, but in practice, QTemp also works. IBMI developers might not be familiar with the session schema, so QTemp is just as good. Be aware, though, that any table created by declare global temporary table is not in the system catalog, so you can't query the columns and the definition and so forth. Also, if QTemp is not on your library list, then you need to qualify references to that global temporary table to either session or QTemp. Here's an example. We've got to declare a global temporary table. It's called work F1, and then we specify as. And then within the parentheses, we specify the select statement, and we can put all the columns in there we want. I chose all in this case. And then the file name, and then we can put select and omit statements. And now, because I'm saying with data, when the table is created, it's going to use the columns from the internal select statement and then populate that table with the data from the result set. Now, there's only two options here. You can either say with data, as I've done here, or you can say with no data, in which case the table is created, but it's empty. Second parameter I'm using here is with replace. And what that does is act like the or replace option on the create or replace table statement, whereby if the global temporary table already exists in QTemp, with replace will cause it to be replaced by this new table. If you don't specify this, you get a runtime message that says global temporary table work F1 already exists. Another way to create a global temporary table is to use the like keyword. This is a little confusing to me in the context of SQL because like means something else on the where clause. But in this case, it's actually similar to the like keyword in RPG when used when defining another data structure. It's actually defining a file like another file. So here I'm using the demo file IBM ships qcust.cdt, which is stored in the QIWS library. So this will create a table called workf1 using the same format as the cust.cdt table. The like keyword basically causes the file to be created with the same columns as the based on file. It's substantially similar to using the ref keyword in DDS. Unlike using a select statement, you cannot copy a set of data into the global temporary table on the declare global temporary table statement itself. You only can create an empty table. Now, to reference a global temporary table, you can simply do this, which is basically specify session dot and then the table name, or you can use QTemp and it will refer to it. Select, insert, update, delete, and so on. Check file access authority. There's an SQL function that provides an easy way to test to see if the user running the SQL statement has access to a specific file. You remember the old check object CL command with the authority parameter? This is substantially similar to that, but it's more basic. It says, does the user have authority to access the file? Yes or no. The statement is SQL check authority with the library name, comma, and then the table name, enclosed in quotes. It returns to you a 1 if the user running the statement is authorized to the file. Otherwise, it returns 0. Technically, this falls under the SQL services category in the Knowledge Center. Let's see an example. Here's some RPG code. Again, I left off the execute SQL on the SQL statements. We're going to use the check authority function. In order to get the return value, we need a host variable that's numeric. I've declared a host variable called authority or auth. That's an integer. We run the value statement and the check authority over the customized file in datalib, and we store the result in the authority variable. Now, since it returns 1 or 0, we simply say in RPG, if authority is 0, let's do something. Otherwise, sorry, you're not allowed to use this file. Pretty simple. End of month. A lot of routines have been written over the years to calculate the end of the month. I created an end of month procedure in Cozzi tools nearly 20 years ago. And about 10 years ago, we created a routine using just RPG's date built-in functions and date data types to do the math all in one statement. was pretty easy to do. Most of these routines work pretty well and can continue to be used if you so desire. SQL, however, now provides a last day function that simply takes a date and returns to you the last day of the month that's represented by that date. Here's an example. We're going to try this 3 different ways. So I have 3 different RPG variables declared: month end, end of June, and a character variable named toDate. So the first one we're going to do uses the current date and calculates the last day of the month for the current date and stores that in a field called month end. Next, we're going to hard code a character string that contains a date in ISO format, and the routine still works, and it returns, in this case, the end of June 2018. And lastly, what I'd like to do is take the current date, pass it to last day, get the last day of the month, but I want that value to be returned to me in USA date format, which is basically month, day, and then a 4-digit year with the / embedded in it. To do that, I wrap the last day function in varchar. And then as the second parameter to varchar, I use USA. So this says to take the current date, calculate the last day of the month, convert it to character in USA format, and store it in the toDate host variable. Next up, converting between upper and lower case. For decades, RPG developers have gone through the pain of trying to convert upper to lowercase and lower to uppercase. In the original version of RPG, RPG2, back in the 70s and 80s, the way to do that was to use the bit-on opcode and actually convert the EBCDIC code using bit manipulation. A more contemporary, and the one most people use today, is to use the built-in function %xlate with a character string that has the lowercase letters and a second character string that has the uppercase letters, and use it to assign a value to itself after it's converted. About 20 years ago, I wrote a 2 upper and 2 lower sub-procedure in Cozzi Tools that uses the QLG convert case API, which is a CSID safe way to convert between upper and lower case. About 5 years ago, I published the code for that in another article. Today, RPG sorely needs %sign upper and %sign lower built-in functions to be added to the language. There's an RFE out there for it now. Let's see if they do it. But today, we can use SQL. SQL contains upper and lower functions. Both of these convert text using a CSID safe conversion method, similar to what I did in Cozzi Tools. The return value is the same length as the input value, so if you're doing a query and things like that, you know what the result length should be. We have 2 variables, customer name and search data. Let's assume a user enters data into an application somehow, whether it's a parameter or it's a green screen or a web interface, and the data that they want to type in and search for is stored in the search data variable. To do a scan of the customer name field to see if whatever the user typed into search data is contained in there, we want to do a case-insensitive scan. Well, there is no %scan I in RPG. So what we do is we use the values SQL statement, wrap the customer name and the search data in the lower function, and then copy it to itself using the into statement. So values lower cust name into cust name, etc. Then in RPG, we simply do a %scan search data, customer name. If it's greater than 0, it found it. And so we can say, yeah, there was a match. Let's process the data. Otherwise, it didn't find it. And we just continue on our way as if we didn't find anything. That's all there is to it. That's your SQL 5x5 for today, accessing members in a multi-member file, creating work files with declare global temporary table, checking file access permission, end of month dates, converting between upper and lower case. This episode of 5x5 is brought to you by SQL iQuery. Why are you wasting your time coding by hand? Check out sqliquery.com for a free trial. I'm Bob Cozzi. I'll see you next time.